3 weeks. The barn doesn't keep a calendar, but I do.
Hi.
And 3 weeks is exactly how long it takes to convince yourself that the thing you are dreading wasn't really that bad. It was that bad. But the drive up is the part where you forget. The mountains do that to you. They make the work seem small. Which is a kindness they can afford, and I can't.
Bravo! Alcuiești. Alcuiești.
There are 2 of them now. I'd explain that, but I'm not going to, because some things just arrive and you let them. Two lizards were having an argument. I don't know what about. I left them to it. Everyone on this hill is working on something. The plan was simple. The hay is upstairs. The best place for the kapitsa is down by the lower door. Flat ground, good light, the other side of the slope. So the hay has to come down. All of it. these openings in the floor. Nelu cut these. In winter, when the snow was too deep to take the horse anywhere, he'd stand up here and drop the hay straight down through them, and Gică would be waiting below to eat it. I'm doing the exact same thing he did. Same holes, same direction, same hay falling through. Just nobody waiting at the bottom this time. I worked for hours. The kind of work where you stop noticing time. Which sounds peaceful and is actually just exhaustion, wearing a nicer coat. And after all of it, I'd moved maybe half. Half the hay, down the stairs, through the holes. I hadn't even started the thing I came here to build. There's a particular feeling that comes when you measure what's left against what you've done. And the math is insulting. I sat down with it for a while. And here's the thing nobody tells you about clearing out an old barn by hand. It's not really about the barn. The barn doesn't care. The barn will stand or fall whether I'm here or not. The work is doing something to me, not to it. The dog had no such crisis. The dog had found the one patch of evening sun on the whole hill and was lying in it like she'd earned it. Of course she had. Morning. I'd like to say I woke up renewed and full of purpose. I woke up sore, and the hay was exactly where I'd left it. Nothing builds itself overnight. I keep being surprised by this. But you get up anyway, that's the whole secret. If there is one. Not motivation, I had none. You just get up and put your hands back on the work.
Look.
and somewhere in the doing, the not wanting to quietly leaves the room. It doesn't announce its exit. You just noticed an hour later that it's gone. And the place rewards you for staying. The light, the noise of it, bees, birds, the whole hill awake and busy. None of it cares that I exist. I find that comforting. I'm not sure what that says about me. It never feels right to cut down a tree. And of all the trees, a birch is the one I'd least like to cut. I love how they look, the white bark, the way the light comes through them, the sound the wind makes through its leaves. But the hay heap needs a spine, a long, straight pole down the middle. And the birch was straight and tall, and it was the one that had to go. And there's a harder truth underneath the soft one. This whole hillside is being taken by birch. It used to be pasture. Cattle grazed here. Somebody kept it clear. Somebody's grandfather walked it every day with a scythe. Now it's going wild. The villagers have a word for a land like this. Perloagă. They don't say it kindly. To them, a hill gone wild isn't beautiful. It's a sign that nobody loves it anymore. So if I want them to take me seriously, the people who've been here longer than my paperwork, I have to keep it clear. Earn it. You don't inherit a place like this. You have to deserve it. A little more every year. You drive the pole into the ground deep enough that it stands on its own. And then you start. Hay around the base, packed tight, working in a circle, around and around, higher and higher. My grandfather built one of these every summer. Ion. He lived in a village called Timișești, near a river called Ozana, cea frumos curgătoare, the same river that a boy Gică grew up next to, in a book every Romanian child has had to read. Whether that's a coincidence depends on how you feel about coincidences. I used to watch him do this. Now I'm doing it. Badly, 300 kilometers and 30 years away. The hay doesn't know the difference. And then it's just repetition. Fork the hay, carry it, lay it down, walk back. Again, again, again. The most honest work there is. Because there's no way to fake it, and nobody to fake it for. There is an old idea, older than me, older than this barn, that you become what you repeatedly do, that the small actions done over and over, or quietly building the person who does them. I don't know if I believe it, but I know that after 2 days of this, I am not the same man who drove up the hill complaining. The hay made me into someone slightly better at making hay. Maybe that is all it ever promises. And then it started to rain. Which meant I had to hurt. Which meant I had a reason. A real, legitimate, weather given reason. To stop. I want to be honest about something. I was not unhappy about the rain. A man can only tell himself just one more forkful so many times before he starts praying for an excuse. And the sky, which owes me nothing, sent one down anyway.
De ce ai făcut bobiță?
I'd built one. One proper STOG. The way Bunico Yon used to call it. One down, and enough hay left for at least 2 more. I'm not going to pretend I could see the end of it. I couldn't.
Aici. Aici. Haide, vină.
On the way out, I stopped to see Gică, Nelu's horse. I'd like to think he recognized me. But there's no reason he should. I stood with him for a while anyway. Nobody who works this land ever finishes it. Nelu didn't. I won't. You clear what you can. You build one more than was there before, and you hand it to whoever comes next. Maybe that's the only honest way to love a place. Not to finish it, just to live it a little better and go.